You might think pirates spent most of their time swaggering around with eye patches and parrots, shouting air, and hunting for buried treasure, but their biggest headache wasn't sword fights or storms. It was navigation, specifically how to convert the stars they saw into useful maps. Yeah, forget Google Maps or GPS. These guys had to figure out how to turn twinkling dots in the sky into actual directions without getting hopelessly lost at sea. Let me tell you something wild about the year 1684, when pirates were literally charting the stars into treasure maps. And trust me, the way they did it was equal parts genius, madness, and outright confusion. First, a little context. If you think steering a ship by the stars is as simple as just pointing at the North Star and calling it a day, think again. Pirates had crews of about 50 men usually, each day depending on roughly 50 gallons of fresh water and tons of salted meat. But all the while, they were sailing vast stretches of ocean with nothing but a few blinking lights overhead to guide them. And no, they didn't have fancy sextants at first, nor reliable clocks to help with longitude. The real killer: the sky isn't exactly a stable friend. Stars move slightly over the course of the night, weather conditions suck, and then there's fog, storms, or just plain bad luck. One wrong move, and you could end up on some deserted rock with nothing but crabs and your own regrets for company. Now here's something history books don't tell you. These pirates didn't just sit around hoping for clear skies. They had a bigger problem than getting lost. They needed to record their navigation in a way that other pirates, or hell, even their future selves after a wild night of grog, could understand. Writing down star positions accurately wasn't as simple as scribbling notes. The problem was how to turn a constantly shifting star field into a fixed map you could fold up and keep in your pocket. Talk about a problem of cosmic proportions. So hold onto your tricorn hats, because the solutions these swashbucklers tried were as laughable as they were desperate. Let's start with the straightforward but doomed attempts. The first idea pirates had was incredibly simple: just draw what you saw, literally. You'd think a rough sketch of the stars on parchment would be easy, right? Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Pirates had a few dozen pieces of parchment, and making accurate star charts meant knowing exactly when you saw which star in which position in the sky. But a pirate's life is anything but routine. Imagine trying to draw stars while your ship is swinging wildly in stormy seas, ink bottles flying, and the occasional drunken sailor stumbling over your sketches. Not pretty. One infamous attempt, recorded in the records of Captain Bartholomew Roberts, a pirate king known for his meticulous logging and penchant for fancy coats, involved a whole crew trying to map out the sky. They'd assign one soberish sailor to mark star positions every hour while the ship rocked. What could go wrong? Well, turns out a lot. Illness, motion sickness, and plain old drunken interference meant that their maps looked more like chaotic confetti than navigational aids. One scrawled map even had a big blotch where someone spilled rum, which some later pirates mistook for a hidden island. Bad idea, really bad idea. But here's the kicker: because the Earth rotates, the stars you see change positions not only through the night, but also through the seasons. So a star map that might have worked in July was useless in November. Pirates didn't know why exactly. They just knew their maps seemed to lie to them at the worst possible moments. Like plotting a course straight into a storm. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation. Now the next failed attempt was even more creative. Some pirate crews decided, hey, maybe if we tattoo stars on our backs, we'll always have the map with us. Yep, you heard that right. At least 3 sailors inducted into Captain Kidd's crew in the early 1600s had crude star maps tattooed between their shoulder blades. It sounded like a great way to keep navigation super secure. Lose the map, lose the tattoo, you lose the pirate's treasure trail forever. Unfortunately, tattoos aren't exactly high-res or practical for sharing information. Plus, guess what? After months at sea, sunburn, salt, and general scrubbing meant half of the tattoos faded or smeared into unrecognizable blobs. And no, they didn't come with sticky notes or legend keys. Let's just say it wasn't pretty. As if that wasn't enough, there was a pirate named Black Sam Bellamy, notorious for being clever but not exactly a stellar planner. He tried the live chart method, which involved using small wooden pegboards where pegs represented stars. Sailors adjusted the pegs to mimic star positions nightly so they could see changes over time. Sounds fun and interactive, right? Well, The boards were heavy, awkward, and more than once went overboard during a squall. Also, when your crew has a habit of pumping rum and throwing things, those pegs often ended up in fights or used as emergency toothpicks. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But here's where it gets interesting. Amid all this chaos, pirates figured out something clever. If stars constantly change position, maybe they shouldn't try to track each individual star. Instead, they started focusing on patterns that were consistent, like constellations. Star clusters like Orion or the Big Dipper became their nautical landmarks. The idea was simple. No matter where you were, these groupings of stars stayed relatively the same shape, acting as celestial signposts. The real genius, though, was when some pirate navigators began using angles between stars and the horizon to understand their latitude. They didn't have protractors, of course, but they made do with basic tools cobbled together at sea. Some pirates even rigged up a crude version of the backstaff, an instrument to measure the sun's or star's altitude without looking directly at them. Thank goodness, none had the brains to stare into the sun. We're not monsters. This allowed them to turn star patterns into real numbers they could record and compare over time. Turns out pirates accidentally discovered the principles behind celestial navigation, something called latitude, long before it was widespread in naval science. By measuring the angle of the North Star above the horizon, they could estimate how far north or south they were. But the catch was longitude, east-west positioning, which was still a nightmare without accurate timekeeping. Every pirate captain knew this. Without knowing the time precisely, your east-west guesses were about as accurate as throwing a dart blindfolded. Now, about how they jotted all this down. Pirates started creating star maps based on coordinates rather than just pictures. They used grids and numeric scales, something like your old graph paper, but way more rudimentary and sloppier. These proto-maps allowed them to transfer star positions from night observations onto parchment, with notes in shorthand about dates and times. Not exactly user-friendly, but way better than tattooing your crew or dropping wooden pegs overboard. One legendary example comes from Henry Morgan's voyages around the Caribbean. His navigators, spoiled by luxury and desperation, created a system that referred to stars as fixed points, and used these to chart courses between Jamaica, Cuba, and the Spanish Main. Morgan's star maps reportedly increased their success rate at avoiding Royal Navy patrols by 70%, a serious win since getting caught meant hanging, and pirates didn't favor that kind of immortal fame. Here's a gem history almost misses. These charts not only helped with navigation, but became coded treasure maps themselves. Pirates loved hiding secret meanings in star maps. Some would circle a star that corresponded with a latitude and longitude on their crude grids, which actually marked where the treasure was buried. So if someone cracked the star chart, they'd find the loot. Pretty cunning for a bunch of rum-fueled rogues. Now, the science behind all this. Pirates didn't understand it, obviously, because they couldn't even locate the oarlocks when swabbing decks, but they stumbled on basic astronomy and geometry. The angle of a star above the horizon depends on your latitude, a fact discovered way before by sailors from ancient Greece but rediscovered, rewritten, and readapted by our salty pirates. They just called it the pirate's eye instead of altitude angle, and it was their version of a water treatment plant for finding fresh water. But for navigation, navigating by the stars was not exactly foolproof, though. Cloudy nights, fog, or storms turned their carefully crafted maps into useless sheets of soggy paper or tattooed skin. So pirates had to learn quick, adjusting their methods constantly, combining dead reckoning, the art of estimating your position based on speed, time, and course, with star maps. It was like mixing a shot of rum with seawater and hoping for the best. And you can probably guess how that ended lots of times. In shipwrecks, lost booty, or mutinies when the navigator insisted the stars said left, but the captain was pretty sure the ship was heading straight into shark territory. Pretty ironic for a bunch that fancied themselves masters of the sea. But before we set sail to part 2 of this stellar saga, remember this. The pirates' star-to-map conversion was a messy, brilliant, and often hilarious struggle that shaped navigation for centuries to come. So next time you look up at the night sky, think about those tattooed, peg-hunting, rum-stained buccaneers trying to make sense of the stars to find their way home or to hidden gold. Because nothing says fearsome predator like a crew collectively squinting at the heavens, hoping the next constellation isn't going to lead them to Davy Jones' locker. Alright, so we left off with pirates fumbling around with star maps, tattoos, and pegboards like a bunch of cosmic clowns. But believe it or not, they didn't just give up and steer by the smell of the seaweed or the nearest albatross's flight path. No, they found ways to upgrade their star-to-map conversions. Still messy, still hilarious, but smarter. Let's dive into what happened next, because this is where the real pirate navigational revolution kicks in. One massive breakthrough was the gradual adoption and brutal adaptation of the cross staff, a simple wooden tool that looked more like a carpenter's abacus than something fit for a buccaneer. Pirates stumbled onto this around the mid-1680s when captured ships or defecting sailors brought these delicate gadgets aboard. The cross staff was designed to measure the angle between the horizon and a star, or the sun, if you had the nerve to stare straight at it, which no self-respecting pirate did. Using this angle, now called the altitude, a navigator could estimate latitude more accurately than just eyeballing the North Star's height above the horizon. Sounds easy. Think again. Picture a pirate trying to hold a 90-centimeter wooden rod steady on a heaving deck after a night's rum binge, salt spray in the eyes, and a crew that considered swashbuckling the least dangerous job on board. Spoiler alert. The first few weeks of cross-staff use resulted in measurements as reliable as a blindfolded monkey throwing darts at a map. But unlike earlier failures, this method actually had scientific backing. Pirates didn't care about understanding Kepler or Ptolemy. They just knew if the cross staff said they were too far north. They changed course, sometimes improving survival rates by at least 30%. Big deal on a ship where misjudging direction by 50 miles meant running into hostile territories or shark-infested waters. Here's a great one. Captain Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, reportedly had a navigator named Israel Hands who became obsessed with perfecting the cross-staff technique. Hands would stand on the forecastle deck, cross-staff in hand, swaying in the moonlight, mumbling about degrees and angles, while the crew exchanged bets on how long before he fell overboard. Hands' improved readings helped Blackbeard sneak past English blockades in the West Indies by charting less obvious routes using star angles. Not too shabby for a guy whose main hobby was lighting slow-burning fuses stuffed into his beard before battle. But as clever as measuring star altitudes was, pirates still had one massive puzzle: longitude. Latitude's easy. It depends on how high the star sits above the horizon. But longitude requires knowing the exact time at your home port compared to local time. A mind-boggling task without precise clocks. And in 1684, marine chronometers accurate enough to solve longitude by the hour wouldn't be invented for another 70 years. Good luck with that. Now, pirates didn't just throw their hands up and sail blind. They developed crude methods blending guesswork and experience. The most common was dead reckoning, calculating your current position by using the last known spot, speed, heading, and time traveled. However, speeds were often guessed because the best they had were log lines, a rope with knots tied every 48 feet, thrown overboard with a piece of wood attached, pulled back in after 30 seconds. By counting how many knots passed through the sailor's fingers, they guessed speed in knots. The term stuck, obviously, but this was rough math on a rolling ship, with drunk sailors miscounting knots or pulling the line too soon. Spoiler alert, dead reckoning was about as reliable as trusting a parrot to keep your secrets. Now here's where some of that chaotic genius kicks back in. To improve this, some pirate captains created logbooks that combined star readings, dead reckoning, and environmental markers like ocean currents or bird sightings, all penned in messy shorthand with secret codes. These logbooks did double duty as star maps and treasure maps, because why not? If you got caught by the Royal Navy, at least the officers scratching their heads over your tally of 3 turtles sighted, star above horizon at 37 degrees, wouldn't figure out where your real gold stash was buried. One famous example involves Captain Henry Every, sometimes called the arch-pirate of the late 1700s. Every's navigators used nightly star readings to adjust dead reckoning calculations, while his maps included detailed annotations on wind shifts and seaweed types. Their success in evading capture and raking loot owes a lot to this hybrid star charting method. which some historians credit with achieving an astonishing accuracy rate of around 75% for crossing the Indian Ocean routes. For pirates who thought math was a curse worse than scurvy, that was downright impressive. But let's talk about something every pirate had to worry about: weather. Because all the star charts in the world were useless under thick clouds or fog. So pirates developed a sort of weather superstition guide tied to celestial observations. If stars twinkled a lot or appeared blurred, it often signaled rough weather ahead. They didn't understand atmospheric turbulence or refraction, but they learned that star shimmer meant stormy seas, clear steady stars meant calm nights. Combining these observations with their star maps helped them decide when to head out, when to hunker down, or when to run full sail for the nearest port. One amusing story from 1684 recounts Captain Anne Bonny, the infamous female pirate, who once refused to navigate through a night of bouncing star flickers. She insisted on waiting at least 12 hours until the stars steadied, much to the frustration of her swashbuckling crew, who just wanted to chase down a Spanish galleon. Turns out, Bonny's superstition was not just bravado. Her decision avoided a sudden squall that smashed their mainmast. Talk about women having better instincts on rough seas. Now, pirates also demonstrated an early knack for astronomical charts, which is really spectacular considering how little they cared for formal education. Some pirate crews took inspiration from Baroque-era European celestial maps that were beautifully illustrated and included mythological figures twisted into star formations. The pirates simplified these by stripping the fancy art and focusing on the stars themselves, but they kept the constellations' names, which became useful mnemonics. It's basically like turning a math textbook into a comic book for sea-smart buccaneers. Here's a wild tidbit. In a pirate haven town called Port Royal in Jamaica, some blacksmiths and artists worked together to mass-produce rudimentary star charts printed on parchment for pirate crews. These charts were smaller, water-resistant versions of official maps, featuring painted star patterns with annotations on optimal sailing routes between key Caribbean islands. Pretty much the 17th century version of an app, minus the screen, battery, and Wi-Fi. Evidence suggests these charts were a hot commodity, traded in taverns along with grog and stolen silk stockings. And let's not forget how pirates dealt with damage to these precious maps. Ships' holds weren't exactly libraries. Water leaks, salt spray, rats, and even drunken fights took a toll on the fragile parchments. Pirates developed a crude method to preserve their maps, coating them with a thin layer of whale oil. Whale oil acted as a sealant, making the paper water-resistant but also translucent and smeary. So when the captain pulled out the map, half the ink sometimes looked like it had been smeared by a kraken's tentacle. Not exactly ideal, but definitely better than soggy pulp. We should give credit where it's due. Pirates accidentally laid groundwork for celestial navigation's big breakthrough. Their trial and error with star measurements, crude instruments, and hybrid logbooks fed into the scientific knowledge of the time, influencing royal navies and explorers. It's ironic. A bunch of rum-soaked outlaws and thieves practically invented tools that would lead to modern navigation. Take that, history textbooks that only praise the clean-shaven aristocrats with polished sextants. At the same time, the tension between pirates' mysterious star maps and their brutal realities made for some seriously dark moments. There are records of crews executing navigators for leading the ship astray, based on misunderstood star readings. One brutal episode in 1684 recounts Captain Thomas II nearly losing his entire crew to starvation and exposure when the navigator insisted the stars indicated a nearby island they never found. Turns out the navigator had miscalculated the star's altitude by nearly 6 degrees, enough error to miss land by hundreds of kilometers. The fallout: mutiny, public flogging, and a lot of empty grog barrels. To wrap this part up with a kicker, while all this star mapping was a chaotic dance of madness, luck, and occasional brilliance, it also forced pirates to build camaraderie and trust. Navigators were treated like eccentric oracles, and despite grog-fueled skepticism, when a navigator said star shows port at dawn, the entire crew listened, even if half the time it meant steering through annoying reefs or swarms of jellyfish. So next time you see a modern GPS blinking quietly on your phone, tip your hat to those rum-soaked renegades who turned flickering stars into navigational gold. They weren't perfect, They weren't scientific geniuses, but they made the night sky their most important treasure map. And if that isn't the most rebellious and brilliant pirate tale you've heard, I don't know what is. Alright, so we left off with pirates finally getting a little handle on the stars and their angles, but still totally bungling longitude, which in 1684 was basically the Bermuda Triangle of navigation. Mysterious, deadly, and impossible to crack. The problem with longitude was that to figure out how far east or west you were, you had to know the exact time difference between your current location and a fixed point back home. Sounds easy, right? Except imagine trying to keep an accurate clock on a ship that's constantly pitching and rolling, soaked with salt spray, and manned by a crew who thought timekeeping was a fancy word for drinking grog at sunset. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Because marine chronometers, the fancy clocks that made longitude calculation possible, wouldn't be perfected for another 70 years, pirates had to get creative. Their answer, a frustrating blend of guesswork, dead reckoning, and wild chance that makes modern-day GPS look like cheating. Dead reckoning was basically this. After you fixed your latitude by measuring the North Star with your cross staff or backstaff, you'd estimate your course by tracking how long you'd been sailing at a given speed and direction. Sounds straightforward, but think of this. Average pirate ships carried about 50 men, used 63-gallon barrels of fresh water daily, and sailed in unpredictable winds and currents. So measuring speed by throwing a knotted rope overboard, the origin of the term knots, with drunken sailors miscounting plus natural ocean currents pushing the ship sideways meant their position was often little more than somewhere close-ish. Not exactly foolproof, unless your plan was to end up shipwrecked on a beach with nothing but seagulls and bad decisions. Now combine this with unpredictable weather. Pirates noticed that cloudy or stormy nights could throw off their star readings completely, because all their measurement tools relied on clear skies. And when storms or fog stopped you from seeing a single star for 24 to 48 hours, your whole navigation rested on hunches and last known positions. Pirates called this praying to the celestial gods and hoping for mercy, which, let's face it, is probably the biggest tech upgrade we could use after a bad GPS lock. But pirates weren't just sitting around cursing their luck. Another smart but messy solution came from what you might call environmental dead reckoning. Combining star charts with natural signs like water temperature, bird flight patterns, and the smell of salt, pirates quickly discovered that certain birds never flew beyond 50 miles from the nearest land, so spotting them meant you were close to shore. They also poked their oars into the water to check temperature variations. Warmer water often meant shallower seas near islands, a bit like sticking your toe in a murky pool to see if you'd survive. Nasty, but strangely effective, and they learned to read the color and smell of seaweed, which floated from different currents, giving them clues whether they were edging closer or farther away from favorite haunts or hostile ports. Here's where the comedy of errors really kicks in. Pirates combined these observations with their star maps, sometimes writing shorthand notes in their logbooks that read like a drunken weather report. Something like star waypoint at 42 degrees north, birds flying southwest, water smells fishy, which only made sense to the navigator and maybe his parrot. But it worked, sort of. Enough to keep ships mostly on the right side of hostile navies and dangerous reefs. Captain Henry Morgan's crew, for example, improved their success navigating the tricky Caribbean routes by roughly 70% by blending these methods, clearly proving that even pirate chaos has a method. Now remember those star maps tattooed on sailors' backs. Yeah, that was a total flop, right? Well, pirates didn't give up on secret maps altogether. They cleverly invented coded star maps, sort of like the 17th century's version of encrypted Google Maps. Those maps would hide treasure locations or secret routes behind symbols tied to star coordinates, like circling a particular constellation and noting X marks the spot as a particular date-time combo. Only the savvy pirates who understood these combining codes could crack the treasure's location. It was brilliant in a way only people who hid gold and loved drinking rum at 2 in the morning could dream up. The downside was these codes often caused confusion. One botched decoding reportedly sent an entire crew hunting for treasure on the wrong Caribbean island, where they endured scorpions, mosquitoes, and a local tribe not so keen on visitors. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation. but it highlights how important the pirates considered their star maps. Losing or messing up one was almost as bad as losing your ship's gunpowder. Speaking of maps, physical preservation was a nightmare. Pirates kept their charts in leather pouches or rolled parchment tubes, both of which constantly faced damage from saltwater leaks, damp hulls, and more than a few curious rats that apparently fancied nibbling on maps instead of cheese. To combat soggy, ink-smudged doom, pirates started coating their parchments with whale oil, which acted like a waterproof sealant while keeping the map flexible. Not exactly museum-quality preservation, but a captain could pull out the smudgy map during a storm and, with a bit of squinting, still tell his navigator the star clusters upside down, turn starboard. The downside: the oil tended to make ink run slightly, sometimes turning Big Dipper into Big Blotter, and led to many a confused night where a star chart looked more like a Rorschach test than a navigation tool. Pirates also seemed to have a habit of combining their maps with daily logs and pirate diaries, messy handwritten journals chronicling star observations, alongside magic rituals to keep storms away. One pirate named Thomas II famously annotated his map with notes like "Ritual performed under Orion, winds favorable." Turns out superstition and navigation went hand in hand. Bad weather meant a quick prayer, but the stars provided actual data when visible. But here's the kicker. Despite all the chaos, pirates contributed fundamentally to the evolution of navigation. Their trial and error with star-based tools, the hybrid logbooks mixing star charts and natural environmental cues, and their practical innovations like using cross-staffs and backstaffs, paved the way for more scientific exploration. Royal navies took notes from captured pirates, and gradually, those rulers of the waves refined those crude star maps and instruments into the sleek sextants and marine chronometers of the 18th century. Here's a brutal truth, though. Navigating by stars was often a matter of life and death. Poor readings could send a ship hundreds of miles off course into shark-infested waters or uncharted reefs, leading to shipwrecks worse than a bad hangover. One documented disaster from late 1684 saw Captain Thomas II nearly doom his entire crew to starvation after his navigator grossly miscalculated star altitudes by nearly 6 degrees. Result: the ship ended up adrift near the desolate coast of Madagascar for over 2 weeks, with 50 pirates reduced to eating stale biscuits infested with wiggling maggots. Bad idea. Really bad idea. The fallout: mutiny was on the menu, lots of fists, public flogging, and a dire shortage of friendly parrots. As rough as it was, star navigation demanded trust. Navigators were treated like eccentric oracles on board, half-mad visionaries swaying under starlight mumbling degrees and celestial secrets, while the crew whispered bets on who'd fall overboard first. When a navigator announced "Star shows port at dawn," the crew listened, even if it meant scrambling through jellyfish or coral reefs. If they wanted a real treasure, it was the survival of the ship and themselves. In the end, the star map conversions pirates invented were as messy as their rum-stained beards but infinitely brave. They had no astronomy degrees, no guaranteed tools, and certainly no YouTube tutorials. They used what they could hack together: wooden rods, knotted ropes, ink-stained parchments, whale oil, and sometimes even skin tattoos. Add a healthy dose of superstition, ruthless pragmatism, and stubborn bravado, and you get the birth of practical celestial navigation. So next time you glance at your phone's GPS, remember that its history was shaped by those unpredictable, raucous crews who turned flickering stars into directions, treasure clues, and the ultimate life-saving maps. Pirates weren't just thieves of the sea. They were accidental scientists navigating an unpredictable universe with wooden sticks and a lot of hope. And isn't that just the most rebellious, brilliant, and slightly ridiculous story the night sky has ever inspired?